Violet Jessop has been referred to as the Queen of sinking ships. During the 1910s, she was on board not one, but two of the world's most infamous ships that sank, and yet she survived to tell the tale on both occasions. Here we examine the incredible story of a woman who was both very unfortunate and also extremely lucky in her experiences. Violet Constance Jessop was born on the 2nd of October 1887 near Bahia Blanca, near Buenos Aires in Argentina. When she was still a child, she contracted tuberculosis, a major disease during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her medical assessment was not good at the time, and it was predicted that she would only live for a few months. However, she pulled through and would go on to live a long life. This was the first episode in which Violet proved to be unlucky, but also lucky. Well, she was unfortunate to contract tuberculosis, but lucky to beat the odds and survive despite the disease. At the age of 16, Violet's father died, following which the family, which was Irish in origin, decided to move back to Europe. There, Violet got her first job, working as a stewardess a few years later on board the Orinoco, a ship of the Royal Mail Line. This was the age of the great passenger steamships, as hundreds of thousands of people were leaving Europe every year for the Americas, hoping to carve out a better life. In the early 1910s, Violet moved to another passenger line company and acquired a job with them as a stewardess. The company in question was the White Star Line Company. In 1908, around the time that Violet had started working as a stewardess, the White Star Line Company had commissioned a new set of ships, which were designed to be the biggest, boldest passenger liners in the world. They would be referred to as the Olympic class of ships, named after the Olympians, the gods of Greek mythology. The chairman of the White Star Line, Bruce Ismay, wanted them to be the most impressive ships ever built, and had acquired backing from the famous American financier J.P. Morgan to that effect. 3 ships were commissioned to be built by the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, in the north of Ireland. The first ship to be completed was the RMS Olympic, which was first launched in 1911. Then, the RMS Titanic, named for the Titans, the generation of gods in Greek mythology who preceded the Olympians, was launched in 1912, followed by the third and final ship, the Britannic, which would not be completed for another 3 years until 1915. Violet was quickly assigned to work as a stewardess on the first ship, when it was completed in 1911. Thus, she was on board the Olympic when it sailed out of Southampton on the 20th of September 1911, on only its 5th ever voyage. The ship was bound for New York, but before it ever made it out of the English Channel, it collided with a British Royal Navy cruiser called the HMS Hawke. The hull of the Olympic was breached, but both it and the Hawke managed to make it back to port and were repaired. In retrospect, the incident boded ill for Violet Jessop's subsequent experiences on the White Star Line's Olympic-class ships. The Olympic spent some weeks being repaired following the incident with the Hawke, but Violet was preparing to get back to work on board the ship a few months later, when she received an offer from her employers to switch over to work as a stewardess on board the second ship of the Olympic-class ships, the Titanic, which was just being completed in Belfast. At first, Violet wasn't interested, preferring the familiarity of the Olympic, but she was convinced by some friends to take the exciting opportunity of working on board what was now the world's largest ship. Hence, when the Titanic pulled out of the port of Southampton on the 10th of April 1912 on its maiden voyage to New York, Violet Jessop was aboard. The ship stopped at Cherbourg in France and Queenstown in Southern Ireland before heading out into the Atlantic with just over 2,000 passengers and crew aboard. The Titanic was not trying to rush to get to America as quickly as possible, as has often been suggested in dramatic renderings of its fateful voyage. However, there was an overconfidence about how indestructible the ship's hull was. Many people believed the ship was so big that it could not be sunk and that even icebergs weren't a danger to it. Perhaps this was the reason why the ship's captain, Edward Smith, took little notice of messages he received on the 13th of April about icebergs off the coast of Newfoundland in Canada. It was a decision he would come to regret. On the night of the 14th of April at 11:40 p.m, the ship hit a large iceberg on the starboard side. This penetrated 5 of the watertight compartments at the base of the ship and flooded them. It had been designed to withstand 4 compartments flooding. Perhaps part of the reason why the hull was breached in this way was that a fire had been burning in the coal storage area of the ship since it pulled out of Belfast over a week earlier, and this had weakened the hull sufficiently for the iceberg to do more damage than it otherwise might have. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The ship began slowly filling with water, and within minutes, it was clear that it was going down. The Titanic had nowhere near enough lifeboats to save everyone, and the waters off Newfoundland are cold enough that an individual can only survive for a maximum of about 25 minutes before their system seizes up and they drown, or their heart gives in from the cold. As such, it was clear many would die once the ship sank. Violet Jessop was one of the lucky ones, as there was a general policy of women and children being given priority access to the lifeboats. Jessop was loaded onto lifeboat 16 of the 20 lifeboats on the ship. As it was being lowered down towards the sea, an officer handed her a baby. Shortly afterwards, in the lifeboat, some distance away from the ship, she would have watched as the Titanic's colossal stern suddenly rose out of the water at approximately 2:10 a.m. As this occurred, the pressure on the centre of the ship became so intense that it snapped in two. It sank rapidly thereafter, as water poured in through massive entry points. The 710 passengers who managed to evacuate the ship on the lifeboats were rescued shortly after 4 a.m, when the RMS Carpathia reached the scene in response to the distress call from the Titanic several hours earlier. They then travelled on to New York. During the 3-day journey, Jessop was approached at one point by a woman who took the baby Violet had been handed as her lifeboat was being lowered from the Titanic. The woman, who was assumed to have been the mother, then ran off crying with the infant without saying a word. Years later, Violet recounted receiving a phone call from someone who did not reveal their identity, but who claimed to have been the baby she saved. One might have assumed that the 700 or so passengers who survived the sinking of the Titanic would never have wanted to set foot on a ship again, and that was the situation for many of the survivors, but not for Violet Jessop. Before long, she was back at work. Then, in the summer of 1914, when the First World War broke out, she volunteered to join the British Red Cross, and through a bizarre set of coincidences, she was posted to work on board the Britannic, the third and final ship in the Olympic class of ships built for the White Star Line. The Britannic had only been finished in Belfast in 1915, 3 years after her sister ship, the Titanic, had gone down. But with the war having impacted drastically on the amount of passengers travelling across the Atlantic from Europe to America, the White Star Line had come to an arrangement whereby the Britannic would be used for the duration of the war as a vast hospital ship for transporting the sick and wounded from the various fronts back to Britain, or acting as a floating hospital in some other areas. Thus, Violet was assigned to it as part of her work with the Red Cross. In late 1915 and into 1916, The Britannic was assigned to the Mediterranean, where Britain had launched the disastrous Gallipoli campaign against the Ottoman Empire in an effort to secure the Dardanelles between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The Britannic successfully carried out several missions to the region in 1915 and 1916, transporting thousands of wounded British and Commonwealth soldiers back to Britain. However, its sixth voyage would not go so well. On the morning of the 21st of November 1916, the Britannic was travelling through the Aegean Sea, the waterway between the Mediterranean and the Dardanelles, when it struck a mine. Unlike with the Titanic several years earlier, the Britannic would not take long to go down, as it leaned dramatically on the starboard side. Jessop, who had experience in this type of situation, very quickly started directing people to the lifebelts before the captain of the ship had even issued a directive. This was a dangerous move, as the ship's engines were still running and threatened to suck the lifeboats into the turbines. Jessop herself ended up abandoning her lifeboat before it was sucked under the ship's keel. Years later, she would discover that she partially fractured her skull during this action, and a doctor told her this was why she was having persistent headaches throughout the late 1910s. However, even the plunge into the Aegean would not prove fatal. Unlike the cold waters of Newfoundland 4 years earlier, the waters here to the east of Greece were comparatively mild even in early winter, and there were ships nearby which were able to quickly respond to the Britannic's distress call. As a result, of the 1,066 passengers which had been on board, only 30 were lost, the other 1,036 being rescued. The Britannic was the largest ship sank in the whole of the First World War. Most people might have decided that they needed to find a new line of work had they experienced what Violet Jessop had in the 1910s with the White Star Line ships, but she didn't. Despite having been in incidents on board all three of the Olympic-class ships, two of which had led to the ship's sinking, she continued to work as a stewardess for many years afterwards. First for the White Star Line, and then with other passenger liner companies in the 1920s and beyond. She married very briefly in 1923 to John James Lewis, a fellow mariner, but the union was a disaster, and they parted after less than a year. Violet's niece later suggested that her aunt, who was heading into her late 30s at the time, had strong reservations about the relationship, even at the time they were wed, but she had possibly entered into it anyway, out of a desire to start a family while she still could. After Lewis and she went their separate ways in 1924, she never married again. Eventually, Violet retired in 1950 after 42 years at sea to Great Ashfield in Suffolk in England. In her later years, she composed a memoir of her experiences on the Titanic and the Britannic, which was edited by the maritime historian John Maxstone Graham. The resulting text was published posthumously. Violet Jessop, the Queen of Sinking Ships, died in 1971 at the age of 83, nearly 60 years after the sinking of the Titanic and the Britannic. Because of how unusual her story was, Jessop has been depicted in several of the many retellings of the story of the Titanic, and characters have been based on her, notably in James Cameron's 1997 film. Thank you everyone for watching this video on Violet Jessop. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. Let me know what you thought of her life down in the comments. If you have any suggestions, also be sure to leave them in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on so you get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.